So today we are going to speak about China in multiple facets, the economic side, the political side, the social sides, and how China is managing all of these sides together with our great host today, our great guest today. Einar, could you please introduce yourself and what do you do for business?
Okay, my name is Einar Tangen. I started as a lawyer. I was in politics in the United States. I'm a U.S. citizen, and I was an investment banker. I am now in China, living in Beijing for the last 15 years. I've written books on the Chinese government system. I've done some economic advising for different levels of the government here. And I'm currently a commentator. I do over 24 different international stations, and I comment on economics and politics associated with China and particularly the US.
It's a great pleasure to be talking to you, Einar. So let's start with the Chinese governance and the economic model. How do you see that?
Well, China has this kind of hybrid model where they have socialist principles. So what does that mean? It means that the state is responsible for making sure that social and economic ends are met. So for instance, the Chinese state said, look, we're going to eradicate poverty as it was defined by the United Nations. And that was, I think, $1.97 per day. And they just recently achieved that. They're still going through an audit to make sure that they can claim that that is actually done. But it's an example. Is poverty a non-issue in China? No, that's not the issue. That's not what has happened. What they have done is gotten rid of extreme poverty. There are still issues that they're continuing to work on. But this is something where you have in Western governments, or I shouldn't say Western, and other governments, they talk about eradicating extreme poverty. In the United States, I mean, we still have almost 15% of the people who have some sort of either food or home insecurity. And there's always this idea about tackling it, but it never actually materializes. It seems to be some sort of like a shuttlecock, which is bandied about when there are elections, each side claiming that they have the key, but it doesn't occur. So in one sense, you have this kind of centralized socialism and the example that I've given you. On the other side, you have a kind of decentralized capitalism. 80% of new jobs and the vitality, new GDP is provided by small, medium-sized enterprises that are privately owned. This is really the lifeblood of China. You hear so often about these state-owned enterprises, in essence, either directly controlled or partially or fully state-funded groups who have, in many cases, monopolies, whether you're talking about energy or banking, etc. Now, China is moving to liberalize that because they understand, when you start with an economy that was dominated by these large groups, but now is dependent on small private enterprises, they have taken steps to open it. So now foreign entities can start their own banks, their own insurance companies. A lot of the areas they can trade in energy. There's still some restrictions, but those restrictions were very important while China was initially developing. Now, unfortunately, they chafed up against the expectations of of countries, especially developed countries like the US, Europe, Japan, South Korea, etc. They felt that China should just fully embrace the kind of models that they have. And this is where you're having a lot of friction. Each side believes that their system is working. And let's get away from what is the best system. In America, we have something called American exceptionalism. This is based on this belief that there is really only one system that works, and it's democratic capitalism. Democratic in the sense that there's a ballot box, that people are free to change the government when they want to, when it's not able to perform its task or respond to the needs of the electorate. Capitalism is the the idea is that it's the most efficient way of delivering goods and services because people have choices and they can vote based, literally on which products or services that they buy. But here's the difficulty. In the many developed countries around the world, democracy is not delivering the kind of governance and leaders that are able to respond to the situation. You can point to the financial meltdown, the COVID-19, both the medical and also the economic response. It just hasn't been very good. You have leaders now that sometimes overpromise. They're populists. They come in saying that there are very simple solutions, that all you need to do is go back to the, quote, good old times, end quote. And this kind of idea that you can, revise today's, reinvent yesterday and pretend that it was somehow perfect and transfer that into today's reality just isn't working. And you've seen this with especially leaders like Donald Trump. In Brazil, you have Bolsonaro. The list goes on and on. Boris Johnson in Great Britain, and so there's some questions about how that is working, and it's particularly true in China. People here look at the system. They used to be very, very interested, and in many cases, the intellectuals said, look, this is what we need. We need to be able to change our governments. But recently, because of the missteps, because people now are voting not in a mixture of their own interests and the interests of society as a whole, but simply on what's good for their pocketbook. And this kind of selfishness is undermining the current state of democracy. On the capitalist side, the idea that somehow everything would work out if you just kind of let the markets go, this Chicago school economic model isn't really working out. What you see are industries, the large industries are dominated by 2 or 3 massive companies, too big to fail. We saw that with the auto companies during the financial meltdown. You see that in the tech world out there. Now, governments are responding belatedly to try to make sure that these monopolies can't dictate prices as opposed to being efficient providers of goods and services. But so far, it hasn't really worked out. And you have these massive oil companies, insurance companies, banks, etc., and they're not working. So on one side, you have this fundamental belief that the only good system is capitalism and democracy. But the reality, and that's the rhetoric, but the reality is that it's not working the way it's supposed to. Whereas China, it has this socialist, as I said, centralized socialist, decentralized capitalist system. It's not the system that everyone in the developed world expects, and they say, therefore, it is bad. And that's where this idea of American exceptionalism, this idea that, yes, the best system should be forced on other countries, and the means justify the ends. This for many seems like a very fascist idea, that no matter whether you want it or not, we're going to force it on you, that if your regime doesn't accept this, we will change it. If you don't do this voluntarily, it'll be done by other means, either economic pressure, political pressure, military pressure, or a combination of all three. So that's where things stand now. You have 2 very different ideas. And for China, the rhetoric is very simple. They don't always explain it, but the reality is 40 years of massive economic, social change. I mean, literally, China was way behind India in the 1960s. Today, China economy is almost 5 times that of India, while they have roughly parity in terms of the actual population. So you have these contrasting models. You have the existing developed world believing, but not actually producing the results, whereas China has been much more pragmatic, has produced the results. And it's doubtful that they're going to change. If you are being very successful at something, whether it's business or personal life, those patterns stay with you. And this idea that somebody else can make you change them when they're successful, there'll be a lot of resistance to that.
So my question here, how feasible are these projects? How can they be successful on this like big population? How can the Chinese government make sure that they have eradicated poverty, for example?
Well, yes, I mean, what they've done is first off, you cannot create change unless you create a ruler, all right? I mean, literally, there has to be measurement, metrics that you could refer to. So in their particular case, they said $1.97 a day. They were going to make sure that no one, absolutely no one in China was below that threshold. So how did they do that? Initially, it was just kind of economic development. There were jobs that were out there. There was infrastructure. There were many things that farmers without a lot of skills could go and get jobs. And this resulted in a huge migration of labor from the countryside and rural areas into cities, which were being rebuilt. So that provided a lot. And then you also had, of course, the factories and things like this. But as you got down to the other levels, you're starting to encounter elderly, people with disabilities, either mental or physical, children left behind by their parents because they were not able to bring them to the cities because they didn't have hukou. Hukou is a system where your entitlement to basic social system, hospital, schools, etc., is based on where you are registered to live, where you were born. And if you go outside that area, you're not entitled to those. So now China is changing that system. But as I said, there were many aspects where it's very difficult when you get down to this lower level, the elderly, people who have been too poorly educated, disabilities, etc., children. So they assigned literally almost a team of government officials. Some are volunteers. These are students who have just graduated from university. They were mobilized along with officials at both the national, provincial, and city and village level to go in and create plans, individual plans, not, oh, we're going to just do one thing and everyone fits into it. Individual plans on one side for villages. Villages in China, some of them are just not feasible. They're very remote. It does not make sense to put a highway, the communications, water, sewer, all of these things to an area which is not only remote, but is not capable of creating a sustaining basic life. The soil is very, very poor. There's nothing that can be grown there. So in those cases, they have said, look, we need to reform. We need to get these people to places where in the future they can have jobs, where the land is fertile, or where they can get jobs in the city. So that's one part. Then the second part is individual plans. So they work with the individual families if they're elderly. In some cases, this means that they're subsidizing these families because they're not capable. If you're 87 years old, you cannot be retrained to do another job, all right? If you're a young child, obviously you can't start working. If you're mentally or physically disabled, you're going to need some additional training and plus perhaps a subsidy. So right now, companies that are willing to hire the mentally, physically disabled, the very poor, are given subsidies to allow them to work. And there can be very simple things, working as guards, literally sitting at a booth and just checking who's coming in and out. Basic cleaning of the streets, the municipal areas. They try as best they can to match people to some sort of endeavor where they're doing something productive. They just don't want to send them a check at home unless there is absolutely no alternative. For instance, they're so physically disabled that they cannot possibly go out for a job. So this is kind of how they're approaching it. But there's a second part of this. The Chinese government has what they call this social credit score system. And for some outside of China, they say, well, and even inside China, it can be controversial. They say, Big Brother is watching you. And yes, the government is watching you. So if you don't pay your bills on time, if you cheat people, all right, if you don't obey the basic laws of society, you're a criminal. You are, in essence, you're put into lower categories. And this affects your ability to take, certain kinds of transportation, planes, first-class trains, go to banks and borrow money. So this is a way of, in essence, rewarding those who play by the rules. For instance, in China's system, there's no way that somebody like Donald Trump could ever be successful in the future, because he cheated so many people along the way, through his bankruptcies, not literally not paying many of the people who built Atlantic City for him on all of these promises, and then he either paid them very, very little, pennies on the dollar for their work. They in turn had to go bankrupt. Things. This kind of scourge is not going to be tolerated. Now, does that come at a cost? Absolutely. Privacy concerns are obviously there. But quite frankly, as we've learned from Snowden and a lot of the other leaks, privacy is pretty much dead if it involves the internet. The ability to track your physical whereabouts, all of your economic activity, even your personal preferences, what books, magazines, how you feel about things. We know that these have been violated. The whole things with Cambridge Analytica. This is the group from England that was offering for sale to identify people who could either be manipulated or who were sympathetic to whatever political leanings you wanted to push. And they, in essence, could tailor make messages to entice these people to become very, very active. This happened, during Brexit. It happened in the U.S. election. It's reason to believe it happened in the British election. And they had a list of clients that went around the world. So this idea that somehow China is using this in a bad way because it's public versus, within the US and other areas, they're using it in a good way because they're lying about it or in essence covering it up, doesn't make any sense. And once again, you're getting this juxtaposition between the rhetoric of what you're supposed to do and the reality of what is being done. And this is kind of driving a wedge between China and also other Asian countries, and to a certain extent, other parts. I mean, this kind of soft power war, it depends on leading by example. And while it's fine to, everyone wants to attack China, for example, in terms of providing loans, they say it's debt trap diplomacy. But no one talks about the fact that without somebody paying for the infrastructure which is badly needed, there won't be any progress. These countries will be, in essence, limited to very low levels of economic opportunity, basically just being resource bases for predatory developed countries or developing countries because they can't develop themselves. So there has to be some sort of balance there. China has said that, based on its own model, it found that developing all of these kinds of infrastructure was the key to developing their economy, getting it to the base, to the point where now they're the second, or depending on the measure, the metrics, the largest economy in the world. So when you start looking at this, you really do sense that there's a difference of approach. And it's worrisome because you start to say, oh, these kinds of frictions, this kind of misunderstanding is possible to lead to some sort of armed conflict.
Let's move to another economic side. What do you think about the digital yuan?
The digital yuan is a game changer, and it's made possible by having some 5G. You need a lot of speed. Basically, a digital yuan is the same as a paper one, except there are major advantages, especially to the government. They can tax at point of transaction. That means no more filling out tax returns, right? Just think of all the army of accountants and people within the government who are playing these games back and forth, how to hide my profits, how to pay the least amount of taxes. This will in essence become moot, as literally the transactions as they occur will be known. That doesn't mean that people won't try. The age-old practice of trying to hide things will continue. That's why if you go to Amsterdam, you'll see houses that are very narrow with only a few windows. Why? Because you were taxed on the number of windows that you had. So people changed the way that they lived in order to avoid taxes. This is an extreme example, but this, it will continue. But from a government point of view, being able to tax things more fairly and more quickly, to understand the revenue flows, to model them in real time. So much government budgetary things are, it's all estimates. What could come in based on a certain level of economic activity, they will actually have a real-time model, which is telling them exactly what kind of revenues are out there. Then there are the fiscal tools that come along with that. The ability to add money into the system very, very quickly and to respond to different sectors based on the models that they have. So this is why things like 5G, artificial intelligence, and these vast sensor arrays, whether it's GPS, which can monitor crops, it can tell you that here the crops in this area are failing, or how to maximize the yields of these fields. These can all be tied together so that you have a much better dashboard in which to do it, in which to manage your economy, both in terms of fiscal tools and actually knowing what's going to happen in real time. Then there are advantages to small, medium-sized enterprises. You take something like RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. This was signed a week and a half ago. And what does it do? It brings 15 countries together, 30% of the world's population, 30% of the world's gross domestic product. And it, in essence, puts them into one trade zone. So if I'm a small, medium-sized enterprise, right, rather than having to learn all of the things necessary to do trade with 15 different countries, I literally can just learn one system, and based on that system, I can trade everywhere. So how does the digital yuan fit into this? The digital yuan could literally be the reserve currency of the future. Why? Because almost all of these countries, the number one trade partner is in essence China. China is over 100 countries in the world. It is the primary trade by volume primary trade partner with these countries. So rather than the system now, which says, well, you use US banks, so you convert your local currency into US dollars, and then those US dollars are taken and paid for goods coming from other countries. Well, that's good while the US dollar is strong, right? While it, people have confidence in it, while you can park your money there and make money. But today we have a situation where a 10-year treasury, all right, will net you after inflation a negative 1% return. So that means for every $100 you put in at the end of the year, you're going to only have 99. So the ability to make money is not there, right? Then you have huge amounts of debt that are being piled onto the US system. Why? Because the economy isn't working. They've had to spend a tremendous amount of stimulus money and still have more to come. Joe Biden has an ambitious plan to put trillions of dollars into education to prepare Americans for the next economy, not only to be competitive, but how to actually do it. Because we've people mention all the time, 50% of the jobs that are available are in operation today will not be around in 5 years. So that means you have to really retrain people for this very different set of circumstances. Otherwise, you're going to have social unrest. You also need to develop the best goods and services so that you're competitive in terms of export. The U.S. has a disadvantage because it's more expensive to produce in the U.S. because of wages and land costs, building costs, etc. So on this one hand, you have the U.S. with these kinds of things. On the Chinese side, they have a working economy. They were able to respond. So they're creating a lot in the world's eye. They're creating a lot of confidence. It's predictable. China has a working economy. It seems to be able to handle crises as they occur. Not only this most recent one, but going back to the financial meltdown. So people are saying, well, why do I need to take the risk on putting into the US dollars, look at a negative 1% return, and then possible weakening of the dollar due to its need for more debt? Because in addition to the money that Joe Biden would like to spend on preparing the economy for the next generation, he also has to do with the past problems, which are the deteriorating infrastructure within the US. So he'd like to put $3 trillion into rebuilding the infrastructure. But $3 trillion here, $3 trillion there, pretty soon it adds up to real money. And right now, China, the US is, depending on who you talk to, different measurings, somewhere between 96, 98%, and some people estimate it as high as 120% of debt to their existing GDP. And that's very dangerous. It exposes the US to rates will rise as people become more concerned about US debt. That means that the US government has to pay out more money, right, to service its debt. I mean, over the last many years, what you had was they were borrowing X amount at 4%. And then over time, they've been borrowing 2 times X at 2%. So despite a massive increase in the deficit, all right, it wasn't reflected in the payments. I mean, there was only about $65 to $80 billion in additional finance costs, despite more than doubling the actual debt load. But that is going to change, and you're already seeing that with more money flows, especially from developed countries, Europe, America, flowing into China because it seems more stable and predictable. So it just makes things easier and more efficient. And remember, if you're thinking about the internet, why is the internet important? Why do we always talk about it in terms of economic consequences, apart from the social and political ones? Is this, it makes things more efficient, right? You cut out the middlemen, useless processes, red tape. It can all be done electronically on the government side and on the private side. It can be monitored. Anything suspicious can be flagged. But this means that you don't have to have as many people involved and therefore less expense. So when it's more efficient like that, the people providing the services and goods can keep more while still offering a lower price to consumers, whether they're business consumers or just you and I. So this is kind of the system that is evolving. The countries that are able to do this, and I'm not talking about the entertainment and video game market, but in this particular area are being more successful.
Let's shift more into the political side. Well, what's your point of view about the liberal democratic capitalist model?
A little bit. It's the idea
Yes, I can hear you.
Political freedoms equal. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Please go ahead. Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The liberal democratic capitalist model is based on this idea that the ballot box and free political expression equal a political nirvana. I mean, this simply by having these things, the ability of democracies to change governments will ensure better governance. But that's not really working very well today. Liberal, the idea behind a liberal was that you had the rule of law, that there were certain actions and rights that people had. But today, what do we see? People are being assassinated by state sponsors. And whether it's somebody being killed in an embassy, being shot, killed by a drone, or being ambushed in their car. Leaders in the past, in the 60s, the US, in South America. So if you're doing those actions and you're saying that this is liberal, that there's a rule of law, things like that, then in theory, you'd be supporting multilateral institutions which are trying to spread the rule of law. But what we've seen with Donald Trump and many other leaders is they're backing away from these multilateral institutions and saying, no, we will not be bound. All right, we will not give up our sovereign rights in order to do that. So the liberal part of this is questionable. Once again, the rhetoric is that everybody should do this. There's a lot of criticism of China for not following through on this, quote, liberal rule of law order. But it's quite apparent that it's not being followed. In fact, it's being disassembled as we speak by the leading countries, the US in particular. Now, that could change under Biden dramatically, but there's a real question. Donald Trump, but for 83,000 votes and 4 states, right? And what I mean by that, if he had gotten 83,000 votes more in those states in terms of what he needed, he'd literally 73 more than voted for him last time. Said that they had confidence in him. So there's a real question about reliable. All right, if just because 73,000 people switched their idea in 4 key states, then people have to kind of wonder, are these times over? Have we really returned to rationality? Or is there an underlying feeling within the US that could switch the US kind of in a seesaw fashion? You go Obama, Trump, then Biden, and then maybe somebody who's a populist like Trump who goes back to these kind of ideas. So this liberal democratic capitalist order, I already talked about capitalism and how the rhetoric and the reality isn't working, and also democracy out of things. Now in China, because it doesn't follow these particular ideas, there's a lot of criticism, but it's only superficial. I mean, there's nothing to show that Chinese officials are going out and killing people in their embassies or assassinating people in other countries or starting forever wars. And breaking entire regions. They have been in all, by any kind of reckoning, very, very conservative. Now there are questions. People say, well, they pursue people who they think have violated their laws overseas. I think almost all countries try to do that. Either try to pressure them to come home one way or the other. It is not unusual in the United States. If we want to get somebody and we think their family was complicit or received funds because of their criminal activity, we will certainly put pressure on them and make sure that it's known on the other side that it says, listen, we're not going to let your family get a free ride because you made them rich by being a criminal. So, I mean, these types of things going on, but for some reason, when China does it, it's bad. when other countries, developed countries do it, it's excusable. And I don't think that's the way it is. There has to be one rule of law, all right? It should be multilateral. Countries that don't abide by it should get pressure, and that includes China. If China's not walking the walk, and if it talks the talk, it has to walk the walk. And if it's not, there's pressure. But the pressure should not be one way. It should not only be on China and then everybody else's excuse. If there's a world order, there are world rules, and there should be some response to that. But going back to my earlier question, be very careful about this one world. Make sure that you're encompassing all of the elements. I mean, there are very different countries, different cultures. As I was that example I gave about how people in different areas of the world look at human rights. Human rights in Africa, in South America, in Asia are not the same as the perspective on human rights if you're in Europe or the United States. And that has to be kept very clearly in mind. Otherwise, you're just going to have a clash of cultures where both sides don't understand or aren't willing to understand the others.
On a social note, what is the social credit score system?
Well, literally, the government tracks, if you have lots of tickets, if you've done something criminal, it goes onto your electronic record, and your electronic record can be checked, all right? You have the opportunity to correct things that were put on there that were wrong. In essence, it's the same system that we have in the US, Europe, and around the world, but that system is created and manned by private enterprises, these credit score entities. They affect your ability to get a loan, in essence, then to get a house or start a business. Anybody could call up and say, give me tell me about this guy. I need a financial report on them or the company. China has taken that inside the government. They don't want private entities to do that. From their perspective, it's too powerful, and it's too open to abuse. Now, from the other side, a lot of conservatives say, well, I don't know if I'm comfortable with the government having this information. But as I said before, the governments already have that. We've seen that with Snowden. The leaks clearly show that the US is processing information about its citizens on a wholesale basis. And if they can't process it by law within the US, they use the system of 5 eyes to do it. So for instance, if I'm an American, I want to get information about my own people, but I'm not allowed to do it. I can ship all of the information to Australia, New Zealand, or Great Britain, or Canada and say, hey, listen, you process this information. You send me any red flags that you think I need to know or information that I should have, all right? And I'll do the same for you. And therefore, we can get around these laws about invading the privacy of our citizens, because we're not doing it, another country's doing it. So it's kind of, it's artifice. China says that this is a good way of rewarding those who pay their bills on time, obey the laws, who are good credit risks, who are doing good things for other people. You can actually repair your credit score system by doing things, by paying your bills on time, by enrolling in areas and doing things that are seen as positive from the government side. So it's not simply retribution. It's not a stick without an ability to repair something. And the Chinese government, I tend to agree, it's better to have this controlled by a government, despite, there will be horror stories about, some poor person being confused from somebody else or something like this, or, somebody showing that they did something that they didn't do, that type of thing. Quite frankly, that already exists in the West. There's a countless number of companies that will, advertise online, credit repair, and what do they really mean? That they know how to work the system, but they have to deal with 3 or more different credit reporting entities and literally go through and try to change that. Well, at least in China, there will only be one. You can at least talk to a government official and say, look, I was wrongly, please have somebody investigate this. And you don't have to spend all of your own money trying to defend yourself against something that didn't happen. And because they can track it electronically, because it's linked to your biometrics, it's going to be much more reliable in terms of who you are. And I was an ex-prosecutor. I did an internship in the Milwaukee County District Attorney's Office, and both my partners were senior district attorneys. I also did defense work. I don't have sympathy for people who are bad, who take advantage of other people on a routine basis, and then use legal means to obfuscate or get out, or just monetary. They just get really good lawyers to do as much as they possibly can and rub shoulders and give campaign donations to judges who suddenly take a very lenient eye towards whatever these scoundrels have done. That's not fair. That is not a system that is sustainable. It smacks of everything that is bad and that civilization is supposed to get rid of. So I do think it's a good system. Of course, the implementation is a huge issue. And the Chinese government is going to have to show that it can do this fairly and, as I said before, efficiently. The efficiency part is very much part of it. Remember, the more money I have in my pocket, the more money I can spend. Disposable income is one of the key indicators today of how an economy is doing. The greater disposable income that a country has of the individuals, that is something where there's a future in that country, especially if it's growing. If it's declining, like you've had in the US and Europe, where middle-class incomes in real terms have been hard hit over the last 30 years. They've had small gains over the last couple of years, but question about how sustainable they were, given that they were debt fueled. In essence, Trump was running trillion-dollar deficits in order to make things look and make people feel very good, but you can't continue to run trillion-dollar deficits and expect it to be sustainable. So it was kind of an artificial sweetener. It makes you feel good in the short run, but there's going to be pain and payback in the long run.
So how effective do you see the government or the state-owned enterprises?
State-owned enterprises are not as efficient as private enterprises. For China, they represent a number of things. First off, it allows them to compete on the world stage. They're not going to be overwhelmed by developed countries. Remember, the developed countries are the ones that have these huge behemoths. They have the large banks, insurance companies, rating agencies have really controlled the system. And it was true in technology. China looked at this because they plan everything, right? Literally. They watch, they learn, they plan. They understood what they were up against, and they did not want a bunch of small Chinese banks trying to go up against these massive behemoths from the developed world. So they had these banking systems. They have their big four banks. And these big four banks are even larger than the behemoths on the West, but that gives them a lot of ability to do financing and things like that, but they're definitely not as efficient. And that's one of the things that China faces today. They're making moves to allow more outside entities come in. Why? Because they want expertise. In China, the system has, the banking system here and finance in general, it revolves around what's called asset financing. If I go into a bank and I say, hey, I got this great idea, it's going to net trillions of dollars. And the banker will look at you and say, yes, that's nice. Do you have any assets? And if you say no, he says, well, I'm sorry. It's a great idea. I wish you luck. Next. And that's not necessarily true in the West. You have a lot more VCs, a lot of instruments to support small, medium-sized enterprises, individuals, entrepreneurs who have a great idea. I mean, I always tell people this is, if you have a great idea, financing is not an issue. But in China, it is, because people aren't used to doing anything other than asset-backed loans. And what the Chinese government would like is for their banks to understand how to do risk evaluation loans, to be more involved, especially with small and medium-sized enterprises. This hotbed of capitalism that exists within China, which is far more vibrant, actually, than anything you'll see in Europe or the United States. And that's one of the great ironies that everyone says, oh, it's a communist country. Well, yeah, but the backbone of this, quote, communist country, which is actually socialist, is in fact capitalism, free, unfettered competition among these smaller entities. So given everything I've said, why do they have the state-owned enterprises? As I said, one part is being able to compete. The second part is just the ability to do projects. For instance, these state-owned enterprises in the railway and highways, building hospitals, large infrastructure. This is a key component, as I discussed earlier, of how China sees the development of the world. You can unlock peace and prosperity by simply allowing countries to maximize their value, to earn income, to raise the standard of living and the disposable income of the people there. Why? Because then those people can spend it on goods and services internationally. And China bets that it can provide a lot of those goods and services at a better price. That's competition that's out there. But in order to get that ball rolling, you need enterprises that are large enough, organized, experienced enough to actually get those done. But over the long term, you've seen a steady, very, very steady decline in the importance and the size of state-owned enterprises in terms of the nation's GDP. And I think you can expect that to continue, especially as China continues to modernize and update its economy, its economic mechanisms.
What are the dangers from your point of view of political and economic nostalgia? And how would you define that?
Okay, so Donald Trump said, "Make America great again." All right. And I remember the stark moment where an African American stood up at one of his open town hall meetings, and he said, "Tell me, when was America great for people of color?" And Donald punted. He just said, "Oh, I do a lot for you people. I'm the best, for you people." The fact is, there was never a time that was, quote, golden. In actuality, if you go back to the 50s and 60s, people say, "Oh, the economics were wonderful." Yes, they were. But the state of the social things, I mean, the amount of prejudice that was, openly used. The Ku Klux Klan was running around, literally hanging and beating people based on their race or creed. It wasn't just African Americans. They did the same thing to Hispanics. They didn't like Jews. They didn't like Catholics. Completely intolerant. So you had Jim Crow laws that prevented people of color from voting. And so, there was no real golden period in terms of everything that was in the country. And you can look at any country and say, when was this, quote, golden period? They always tend to, the further away it is, the more wonderful it supposedly was. But if you go back to that period in history, you'll find that they confronted the same problems that they have today. There might have been greater economic prosperity, but there were also greater social imbalances, and they're there. So this idea that you're going back to the future, no, it just doesn't work. First, it's not true. Second, you can't do it. And that's proven by what, Donald Trump's record. He said he was going to make America great again. He was going to build a wall. He was going to, tame China. He was going to defeat the deficit. Well, the deficit with China economically is larger, 25% larger today than it was at the beginning of his tenure. There's no wall on the southern side. Keeping immigrants out of a country composed of immigrants is kind of an odd idea, but these are things that are easily sold to people. So this is what it is. It's this kind of populist appeal, this Happy Days. There was a comedy called Happy Days. It was based in Milwaukee, and it was about the good old days of the 50s when things were, quote, simpler. Well, they actually weren't simpler, all right? And you can't go back to those times and pretend that everything is going to be all right. But it's a natural inclination for people to want to do that. Now, in terms of the dangers, when you set up these kind of unrealistic expectations and expect the rest of the world to support your nostalgic view of the world, it runs into real life. People don't want to go back. Well, why would people in the developing world, right, the emerging world, want to go back to the 50s and 60s when they were that was a Cold War period? The economies were in a terrible shape. They were losing their economic clout to the United States and Europe. Why is this a golden period for them? So this idea, the nostalgia always speaks to this idea that I'm going to take care of me and the hell with you. And that, unfortunately, doesn't work. It just creates these hardline conflicts where people say, you're preventing me from getting what I want, therefore you're the enemy, and you start having real frictions, and you can do that. Now, remember, what happened between World War I and II? Why did Hitler rise to power? What did he promise? He promised a rejuvenated, Germany, that it would no longer be humbled, that it would no longer, be under the whip of the Allied powers who had forced on them reparations. Right? He was going to restore people's, their sense of pride, this type of thing. But it wasn't real. He used this kind of fascist mix of the Third Reich and the 1,000-year Reich, 10,000-year Reich, and how they were going to rule the world, and the superiority of the white German race, and how they were descended from Norse gods. I mean, it was just unbelievable if you look at it today. But what was he selling? Nostalgia. All right, the same thing with El Duce in Italy. He was talking about former glories. So in every period, when you have these populists jump up and start talking about the glories of the past and how they can return the country to it, invariably it leads to some sort of confrontation. And it doesn't work. Because you can't go back in time. Things change. The world is dynamic. But it sets up these inbuilt conflicts with other countries, because if you're going to win in this particular game, it becomes zero sum. These people are saying, I'm going to take what I want, and that means I'm going to take from you. And that's not going to be very well received by the countries who perceive themselves on the losing end of that particular bargain.
Yeah, it has been more than awesome, as usual, talking to you, Einar. Thank you so much for your time.
All right, my pleasure. Take care.